He lined them up on their knees. 6 rangers, hands zip-tied behind their backs, heads bowed, kneeling in the dirt of the compound's central yard like they were waiting for a verdict nobody was going to read aloud. Colonel Boyd Strickland walked behind them slowly, deliberately. His boots on the dry Carolina clay made a sound like a metronome counting down to something. He stopped behind each man long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, then moved to the next. He was not a cruel man. That was what made it effective. When he reached the end of the line, he walked back to the beginning, stopped behind the first ranger again, placed one hand on the man's shoulder, bent down, spoke low enough to be intimate, loud enough for every man on the line to hear every word. "I designed every op-for scenario run in this valley for the last 10 years, he said. Every approach vector, every counter-infiltration position, every blind spot and every tripwire and every angle of fire and every approach to this compound." He stood back up, looked out at the tree line beyond the wall, the mountain, the dark ridge line where the pines stood motionless against the pre-dawn sky. If there is someone out there right now, they are walking into something they do not understand, and they will not walk back out the same way they came in. He let that settle. Then he said the words that would become the heaviest thing he ever carried. "Let them try." Nobody answered. Nobody moved. The 6 rangers stayed on their knees and looked at the dirt. And somewhere 900 yards up the slope, through a Mark 13 scope on a cold bipod resting in a natural depression in the earth, a pair of eyes watched Strickland turn and walk back toward the operations building. Watched him without blinking. Counted his steps. Noted the time. Added the data to the 22 hours of data already stored in a mind that had been working without pause, without sleep, without a single unnecessary movement since before those 6 rangers had eaten their last hot meal. The crosshairs moved, slow, systematic, across the compound wall, across the 2 sentries near the gate, across the camera housing on the northeast corner, across the junction box mounted to the exterior wall of the main building, then back to Strickland's retreating figure. One breath, the crosshairs held, then moved on. Staff Sergeant Vera Colston had been in this position for 22 hours and 14 minutes. She knew the exact number because she had noted the time when her elbows first touched the ground, and she had been tracking the minutes the way a pilot tracks altitude. Not obsessively, the way you track something that matters enough to know but not enough to think about constantly. A background number. A fact. Part of the larger picture she had been assembling with the same patience and the same precision that her first instructor had told her 13 years ago at Quantico was the only real difference between a trained sniper and a man with a rifle. She had not moved from this depression in 22 hours. Not significantly. She had shifted weight twice, both times by fractions, to manage blood flow in her left hip. She had consumed 600 calories from a pouch she did not taste. She had watched the compound below go through 2 full night cycles and 1 dawn. She had watched the sentries rotate, watched the lights in the operations building dim and brighten, watched the patrol patterns repeat with the predictability of people who believed in the security of their perimeter. She had believed in it too briefly when she first arrived. The briefing had described a standard upward defensive posture, 6 to 8 rotating guards, standard coverage arcs, moderate threat level. The briefing had been written by someone looking at satellite imagery. Vera Colston had been looking through a scope. The man on the north face was not a rotating guard. Rotating guards have routes. They walk them. They return. They are creatures of movement and pattern and predictable rhythm. The man on the north face had not moved his body in 4 hours except 3 times, each time a fractional adjustment of his position to compensate for a shift in ambient light that was changing how his scope gathered the darkness. That was not guard behavior. That was her behavior. That was the behavior of someone who had settled into a hide with the full intention of staying there, because his job required stillness and patience and the specific kind of endurance that most people never develop, because most people never have a reason to. She recognized it because it was exactly what she was doing. She did not key her comms when she found him. She did not move. She shifted the scope 2 degrees east and began looking for the next one. She found him in 40 minutes. She found a third before midnight. By the time Strickland finished his speech and walked back toward the operations building, Vera had 7 of the 9 positions identified with high confidence. The remaining 2 were in sectors where the ground did not give her clean information. That was fine. She would find them. She had been finding things in terrain like this since she was 23 years old, and the mountain had never once refused to tell her the truth if she listened long enough and quietly enough to hear it. The envelope had come through channels she did not ask questions about. Thick paper, no return address. Inside, a folded sheet of handwriting she recognized as belonging to a man whose voice she had heard exactly twice on a radio, never in person. She had read it standing in the staging area at 0400 under a red light with the cold air of the Carolina pre-dawn moving through the trees around her. She read it twice. Then she lit the corner of it with a match from her kit and held it until the last readable fragment curled to ash between her fingers. The instructions were 7 sentences. 5 of them were operational parameters. Standard mission language, threat assessment, objective location, extraction window, primary and secondary communication frequencies. The 6th sentence was the one that changed the shape of everything. Non-lethal contact only. Mark, report, and observe. Do not engage with lethal force under any circumstances. She had read that sentence 3 times before she read the 7th. She was still thinking about it when she zipped her pack and started up the slope. Standing there in the staging area, burning that paper, she was a woman with a specific set of constraints she had not been given a reason for, and a mission that did not fully make sense without knowing why those constraints existed. She had accepted all of that. She had accepted it the way she accepted most things that came from the level above her pay grade, not with blind obedience, with the recognition that she was one set of eyes in a much larger operation and that the information available to her was not the total picture. But the question was open, and open questions in the field were exactly the kind of thing that got people killed. Why no lethal contact? She filed it in the same place she filed everything she did not yet have enough data to answer. And she started up the mountain. The compound sat in a natural bowl at the base of a ridgeline that ran roughly north to south across the western portion of the Black Ridge Proving Ground. The approach from the east was the obvious one, which meant it was also the most heavily covered. Vera had not used the eastern approach. She had come in from a direction the terrain made difficult enough that most planners would discount it as an insertion route, which was precisely why she had chosen it. The northwest slope was steep, rocky, and offered almost no natural concealment for the first 400 meters. After that, the pine forest was dense enough to swallow a regiment. She had moved through the open section in darkness, 3 hours before the moon rose, using ground cover so shallow that from any angle above, she would have been invisible by instinct and training alone. 22 hours later, she was settled 200 meters inside the tree line, with a sight line through a natural gap in the canopy that gave her coverage on the compound's north and western approaches. It was not the position she would have chosen on a clean map. It was the position the mountain offered her. And Vera Colston had long since stopped expecting the mountain to cooperate with what she had planned in advance. You took what the ground gave you. You worked with it. That was the whole job. She moved the scope to the northeast corner of the compound wall. The camera housing there had been bothering her since the first hour. Not because of what it was, but because of how it was mounted. Standard camera installations sit flush against the wall, angled downward to cover the ground approach. This one was mounted 6 inches proud on a steel bracket, elevated slightly, with a secondary housing on the near side that she had initially assumed was a cable management box. She had been looking at it on and off for 22 hours, and 3 hours ago, she had understood what the secondary housing actually was. A thermal sensor, secondary, redundant, meant to catch what the primary camera might miss in low light. That was not in the briefing. She shifted her weight fractionally to her right hip, breathed, let her mind run the geometry without directing it, the way her instructor had taught her. Do not reach for the answer. Let the ground deliver it. The ground delivered it in 4 minutes. The camera's thermal sensor operated on a passive infrared principle. It detected differential heat signatures against the ambient temperature of its environment. In the current conditions, with the overnight temperature having dropped the ambient ground temperature to approximately 41 degrees, her body heat at this distance was well within detectable range if she moved. The sensor's effective radius was approximately 600 meters based on the housing size she was estimating through the scope. She was at 900. She filed that, moved on. The mistake most people made with cameras and sensors and technical security systems was treating them as absolute barriers. They were not. They were data collection devices operated by human beings who had to interpret the data and act on it. And human beings, however well trained, had operating patterns. They had attention spans. They had the specific vulnerability of people who had been watching a screen that shows nothing unusual for a long time, which is that they stop fully processing what they see and start simply confirming that the pattern continues as expected. Vera did not need to defeat the camera. She needed to understand it well enough to move when it could not tell the story of her movement to anyone who would act on it. She was still working through that problem when a sound reached her from somewhere below and behind. Not the compound, not the mountain's ambient sound, something deliberate, rhythmic, so faint that a person without her specific training in the specific art of lying absolutely motionless in terrain and listening to it for extended periods would have missed it entirely. Footsteps. She did not move. She did not redirect her scope. She identified the direction from sound alone, estimated the distance and speed, calculated the most probable route based on the terrain between that sound and her current position, and concluded two things simultaneously. One, whoever was approaching was not trying particularly hard to be quiet. Two, they were not heading directly toward her. She waited. The footsteps passed 30 meters to her left, moving on a line that would take them around the northern edge of her sector and back toward the compound. A single person, male, based on stride length and weight distribution, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had every reason to be there. When the sound had faded enough that she was confident in the distance, she moved the scope carefully to the left and found the figure emerging from the tree line 200 meters away. Master Sergeant Cal Overton. She recognized him from the mission photography she had memorized before insertion. His face was turned away from her, but his posture was unmistakable. He stood at the tree line for a moment, looking back into the forest with an expression she could not read at this distance. Then he turned toward the compound and walked. He had not seen her. She was almost certain he had not seen her. She noted the time, added it to the log she kept only in memory because anything written could be found. The first hour of daylight brought what it always brought, change. The temperature rose. The light shifted. The ambient sound of the forest reorganized itself as nocturnal animals retreated and diurnal ones moved to take their places. The compound below came awake in stages. She watched men move from the bunkhouse to the mess facility and back. Watched the century rotation happen with the mechanical reliability of a schedule that had not varied in the 2 days she had been observing. 9 positions, 7 confirmed, 2 outstanding. She worked the problem of the 2 remaining positions the same way she had worked the first 7, not by looking for them directly, but by looking for what they caused. A sniper in position affects the terrain around him. Birds avoid the area. Small animals alter their routes. The patterns of shadow and sound and movement that constitute the background noise of a living forest develop small gaps and inconsistencies that are individually meaningless and collectively a map, if you know how to read it. She found the 8th position at 0920. The gap in the bird song to the south-southeast was too precise, too consistent, and too small to be natural. She spent 40 minutes confirming it before she added it to the map in her mind. The 9th took until mid-morning, and when she found it, she stopped breathing for 3 seconds. It was not where she had expected it. It was not where any competent defensive planner would have put a 9th position based on the existing 8, because the existing 8 already covered every standard approach to the compound with overlapping fields of fire. A 9th position at any of the logical locations would have been redundant. Strickland had not put it at a logical location. He had put it at the one location that covered the approach she had used to get in, not pointing outward, pointing inward, into the forest behind her, covering the sector she was currently occupying from the compound side. She had been in this mountain for 22 hours. She had been this close to the compound, within this particular sector, for 16 of those hours. And the 9th position had been watching her sector the entire time. She moved the scope to the 9th position, found the outline of a man in a ghillie suit against a rock formation she had assessed as unoccupied 12 hours ago. He was still, professional. His scope was oriented into the forest on a line that swept across her position every 8 to 12 minutes. She watched him complete one sweep, noted the timing, 2 sweep cycles, confirmed the interval. He had swept across her position at least 40 times in the last 8 hours. He had not seen her. She did not take that to mean she had not been seen. She took it to mean she had not been seen yet. There was a difference. and the difference mattered. She did not key her comms, she did not move. She did what the situation required, which was to continue doing exactly what she had been doing, because the only thing worse than being undetected in a compromised position was moving in a compromised position and accelerating the moment of detection. She breathed, counted, watched. 40 minutes later, she was ready. The camera housing on the northeast corner had a secondary support strut made of galvanized steel, 3 centimeters in diameter, installed at a 45-degree angle between the camera bracket and the wall. The strut was positioned in such a way that it acted as a partial heat sink for the camera's internal components during operation. It also, at this particular hour of the morning, with the sun at this particular angle, was absorbing direct sunlight in a way that was warming it beyond ambient temperature. The thermal sensor next to the camera was designed to detect objects warmer than the ambient environment. If the strut were strung in a way that generated friction heat, it would read as a thermal event on the sensor. The sensor would generate an alert. The alert would go to a monitor inside the operations building. The monitor would look at the screen, would see a metal strut registering heat and no other movement, would log it as a sensor anomaly, would continue watching. For approximately 18 to 22 minutes, based on the cooling rate of galvanized steel in these temperature and wind conditions, the camera's thermal coverage would be distorted enough by the false reading to create a functional gap in its detection field. 18 to 22 minutes was more than she needed. The shot was 412 meters, crosswind at 11 knots from the west-northwest, a 7-degree elevation differential between her position and the target, and a target width of 3 centimeters. The Mark 13 was zeroed at 900. She made the mental correction, breathed, aligned, let her pulse settle between beats. She fired. The suppressor on the Mark 13 Mod 7 was an OSS Helix 338. At this range, in these conditions, the sound signature was a compressed percussive report that dissipated to near inaudibility within 200 meters. The bullet crossed the distance in just over half a second. The galvanized steel strut rang once, a sound no different from the wind moving through the compound's metal fixtures, and the friction heat of impact began radiating outward in a signature that would confuse the thermal sensor for exactly as long as she had calculated it would. Inside the operations building, a monitor looked at his screen, saw an anomaly, logged it, continued watching. Vera was already moving. Not fast. Fast was wrong. Fast was the mistake of people who understood the principle of not being seen, but not the discipline. She moved with the specific economy of someone for whom movement itself was a skill, not just a physical act. Weight forward, heel to toe, 3 points of contact with the ground at all times when the vegetation was uncertain underfoot, 2 points when it was solid. She had moved through terrain like this enough times that it no longer required conscious thought. Her body knew the grammar of it. Her mind was free to watch. She covered 60 meters in 11 minutes, stopped, assessed, moved again. The outer perimeter wire came into view at a distance of 40 meters. She stopped behind a pine trunk and let her eyes adjust to the light beyond the wire. Identified the nearest sensor post. Identified the ground between her and the wire. Ordered the placement of the trip line running parallel to the wire at approximately 1 meter inside. Standard installation, the kind she had seen at 6 other facilities in 4 states over the course of a career that had taken her to every corner of the country the Army and the Marine Corps used for training that needed to stay quiet. She moved to the wire in 4 minutes, crouched, examined the trip line from a distance of 30 centimeters, found the tension section, identified the anchor points, extracted a small folding tool from her kit, and used it to gently shift the tension on the near anchor by 11 millimeters, creating enough slack to step over without disturbing the line's pressure threshold. She stepped through, reset the tension, waited 30 seconds, listened. Nothing. She was inside the outer perimeter. The compound wall was 40 meters ahead. The sentry rotation she had been tracking for 22 hours would bring the nearest patrol to within 20 feet of her current position in approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She would be at the wall before the patrol arrived. She moved. The wall was stone and mortar, 2 meters high, built with the specificity of a structure intended to be a serious obstacle rather than merely a visual barrier. She did not try to go over it, Going over created a visual profile against the sky for the span of the movement, and a visual profile against the sky, even brief, even at this hour, was the kind of thing that the ninth position might catch in a sweep. She went along it, south toward the junction box she had identified on the first evening. The junction box was where the compound's primary communication relay connected to its external antenna array. It was also, she had noticed, mounted at a height and angle that put a 2-meter section of the wall's eastern face in its own shadow regardless of sun angle. A shadow within a shadow, the smallest possible margin, in a profession where every margin was the difference between the mission and the alternative. She reached the junction box, pressed her back to the stone, looked at her watch. 41 minutes since she had fired. The thermal sensor's distortion window was nearly closed. She was in position. She was not visible from any of the 9 sniper positions she had mapped. She was not in the patrol route. She was not in the camera's primary coverage arc. She breathed. Then something happened that was not in any scenario she had run in her mind during 22 hours of preparation. A light appeared in the narrow gap between the bottom of the compound wall's access door and the ground. Not overhead lighting, not a flashlight, something smaller, intermittent. She watched it for 11 seconds before she recognized the pattern. Morse code. Not practice, not a test. The rhythm was too deliberate, too controlled, too much like a person who had been sending the same message for long enough that the sending of it had become muscle memory. She pressed closer to the wall and read it. It took her 40 seconds to read it completely. Short words, simple structure. The kind of communication a person creates when they know their time and resources are limited, and every character costs something. The last 2 characters of the full sequence were a pair of letters, not part of the message itself, added after, the way a person signs their name to something they need attributed. CA. Vera stayed completely still for 90 seconds after the light stopped. Then she keyed her comms for the first time in 22 hours. Karsten. She kept her voice at the volume of thought. I have a signal from inside the compound. Active, continuous. This is not part of the exercise. 12 seconds of silence. The kind of silence that has weight in it. Then Major Lyle Karsten's voice came back through the earpiece. Level, controlled, the way it always was. Confirm the signal before you report further. She looked at the gap under the door. The light was still. The signal had stopped. But the memory of it was precise and complete in her mind. The way all things she observed precisely were complete. She could read it again in her head anytime she needed to. She pressed transmit again. I've confirmed it, Major. Someone inside that compound is sending. They've been at it long enough that it's become muscle memory. This is not a drill component. Another silence. Longer this time. Hold your position. Continue observation. Do not act. She waited for more. Nothing came. She released the transmit button, kept her back against the stone, looked at the gap under the door where the light had been. Then she looked at her watch. Then she looked back at the gap. Karsten had not asked her what the signal said. Not once. Not even the natural professional follow-up of a man receiving unexpected intelligence from a field operative. He had not asked what frequency, had not asked what the content was, had not asked if it was a distress call or a data burst or a ranging signal or anything else. He had heard there was a signal from inside the compound and told her to hold. A man who did not already know there was someone in that compound would have asked. She keyed her comms one more time. Karsten, the last 2 characters of the signal were a personal identifier. 2 letters, C and A. The silence this time was 8 seconds. Colston, hold your position. I'm working on resourcing. She released transmit, stared at the stone wall in front of her face. The initials C and A belonged to exactly one person in the operational files she had reviewed before this insertion. A name attached to a case number attached to a status report she had read in a classified briefing room 6 months ago. A status report that had listed that person's status as one specific word. Deceased. She thought about that for 30 seconds. Then she thought about Karsten's voice. Then she thought about the 7 sentences in the envelope she had burned at 0400 in the staging area. The 6th sentence, the one she had read 3 times. Non-lethal contact only. She had assumed that instruction was about protecting the integrity of the exercise, about maintaining the fiction of the training scenario for purposes of assessment. Standing here with her back against this wall, in the dark gap between a junction box and a compound where someone who was supposed to be dead was sending Morse code, she was no longer assuming anything. She did not key the comms again. She pressed her back harder against the stone, slowed her breathing to the rate she used in the moment before a shot. Let her mind run the data without directing it. Let the ground tell her what it knew. What the ground told her was this. She had been given a mission with constraints she did not understand, inserted alone into a position with 9 professional snipers she had not been briefed on, and the one person coordinating her mission had just responded to impossible intelligence with the specific flat certainty of a man who had already known that intelligence existed. 22 hours on that slope, 9 positions mapped, outer perimeter breached, inside the wall. And the mission she thought she was running might not be the mission she was actually running. The gap under the door was dark. The signal had stopped. But whoever had been sending it was still in there. She looked at her watch one more time, memorized the reading, added it to everything else she had memorized. Then she settled in against the stone to wait. Because waiting when you did not yet have enough information to act correctly was not passivity. It was the discipline of someone who understood that the wrong action at the wrong moment was worse than no action at all. And Vera Colston had understood that since she was 23 years old, lying in the cold mud of a Quantico training range while a man named Hale Braddock walked back and forth 30 meters away and told her recruits that the ground would give them everything they needed if they could only learn to stay still long enough to let it. She was still learning, but she was very, very good at staying still. The signal had stopped. But Vera did not move away from the wall. She stayed in the shadow gap between the junction box and the stone, her back flat against the mortar, her breathing at the rate she used when she needed her body to cost as little as possible. She was thinking, not about what to do next, about what she had already heard and what the shape of it meant, and why the shape of it felt wrong in a way she could not yet name precisely enough to act on. Karsten had not asked what the signal said. She turned that fact over for the 3rd time. A man receiving unexpected intelligence from a field operative in a classified insertion asks follow-up questions. That is not procedure. That is human. You hear that your operative has found something she was not supposed to find, something that changes the parameters of the mission she is running, and the first words out of your mouth are, what did it say? Not hold your position, not I am working on resourcing. Not the flat professional calm of a man who has already processed the surprise, because he was not surprised. Karsten had heard there was a signal and had told her to stay put. She pressed that fact into the part of her memory she used for things that were not yet actionable, but were too important to lose. Then she carefully, without sound, changed her angle against the wall and looked at the gap under the door one more time. Dark, still, the sender was not transmitting, but the sender was still in there. She was certain of that the way she was certain of things she could not directly confirm, which was to say with the specific confidence of a person who has spent 13 years learning to read the geometry of a situation and trust what it tells her even before the evidence assembles itself into something anyone else would call proof. The signal had been too controlled, too deliberate, too much like the product of someone who had been sending it for days and had refined it to its most essential form. That kind of communication does not come from someone who has given up or gone passive. It comes from someone who is still working, still waiting, still choosing to burn calories on a task that only makes sense if you believe someone will eventually receive it. Someone inside that compound believed someone was coming. She wondered if they knew it was her. Then she stopped wondering because it did not change anything. The signal existed. The sender existed. Karsten's non-response to the content existed. Those were the facts she had to work with, and she was going to work with them the same way she worked with every other incomplete picture the field had ever given her. One piece at a time, no assumptions about the pieces she did not yet have. She moved, not toward the door, back along the wall, south the way she had come, retracing her path with the same economy she had used to make it. 20 minutes to cross the distance her body had covered in 40 during the approach, because going back was always faster than going in, and because the thermal distortion window from the shot had long since closed, and because the 9th position was still out there somewhere behind her, sweeping its sector on a 12-minute cycle, and she was not going to be visible in that sweep if she could help it. She reached the outer wire, stepped through the managed slack, reset the tension, moved back into the trees. The forest received her the way forests always received her when she moved correctly through them, which was to say it did not notice her. The pine needles absorbed her footfalls. The underbrush closed behind her. Inside 40 meters, She was part of the mountain again. Not a person on it, but a feature of it. In the compound below and behind her could have been a mile away for all the evidence she left of her passage. She found her position, settled back into the depression, put her eye to the scope. The compound was the same as she had left it. Sentries rotating, lights in the operations building holding steady. The ninth position she confirmed after 4 minutes of observation had not moved. His sweep was still on the same cycle. He had not been alerted. She had not been seen. She let herself note that factually, without satisfaction, because satisfaction was the beginning of the kind of relaxation that preceded mistakes, and she was not in a position to afford mistakes. Then she settled in and began working the problem of what she was going to do with the next several hours, which was the most important problem she had, and also the one she had the least information to solve correctly. She had been in position for 26 hours. She had found 9 sniper positions instead of the briefed 6 to 8 rotating guards. She had breached the outer perimeter without detection. She had received a Morse signal from inside the compound, signed with initials belonging to a man the official record said was dead. She had reported the signal to the one person in the chain who was supposed to help her make sense of it, and he had responded in a way that made less sense the longer she looked at it. She began working backward from that last point, the way her instructor at Quantico had taught her to work backward from any result that did not match the model. You did not start with the answer and look for the question. You started with the question that the answer created and worked your way down to the bedrock of what you knew for certain. What she knew for certain was 3 things. The man who had given her this mission had known, before she called it in, that there was a signal source inside that compound. The man who had given her this mission had written the instruction against lethal contact before she had ever set foot on this mountain. The man who had given her this mission had still not asked her what the signal said. The bedrock below those 3 things was not comfortable to stand on. She was still standing on it when the forest to her left changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have registered as meaningful to someone who had not spent 600 hours of their professional life learning to hear the forest the way other people learn to hear music. A gap in sound where there should have been small sound. The specific kind of silence that opens up when something living stops moving but does not stop existing because it senses another presence and goes still in response to it. She did not move. She let her peripheral vision work while her eyes stayed on the scope. Whatever was to her left was between 30 and 50 meters away, moving or recently stopped, and moving with enough discipline to produce this particular quality of silence, rather than the blundering noise that untrained personnel made in woodland terrain. 40 seconds. The sound returned. Footsteps. Not moving toward her. Moving parallel to her position. Bearing south-southwest at a pace that suggested someone who knew where they were going and was not in a hurry about getting there, but was not comfortable enough to be careless about noise either. She gave it 2 minutes. Then she shifted the scope left and swept the tree line at the estimated range. Corporal Danny Foss, 26 years old, the youngest member of the ranger team attached to this compound exercise. She had been a peripheral figure in the mission photography, backgrounded in most of the shots. The kind of person whose face you had to look for deliberately rather than the kind that pushed itself forward. She was walking a line that was not on any patrol route Vera had observed in 26 hours of watching this compound's security patterns. Vera watched her move, tracked her through the scope. Foss had her weapon slung, not raised, which was inconsistent with a combat patrol in an active exercise zone. She was looking at the ground more than at her surroundings, which was also inconsistent. Not the ground ahead of her feet, the ground to her sides, the way a person looks at ground when they are reading it for signs of recent passage. She was tracking. Vera watched her for 6 minutes. Foss stopped, crouched, looked at something on the ground at the base of a pine tree 8 meters from where Vera's boot had last contacted soil during her return from the wall. She stayed in the crouch for 30 seconds. Then she reached into a cargo pocket, removed something small, and spent what appeared to be 45 seconds doing something with her hands at ground level that Vera could not fully resolve at this range. Then Foss stood, slung her weapon again, looked back the way she had come, keyed her comms. Vera could not hear what she said. She watched Foss's lips for a count of 4 seconds. The transmission was short, 8 to 12 words. Then Foss released the transmit button and waited. She waited 15 seconds, which was longer than a standard radio check. Then she turned and walked back toward the compound at the same unhurried pace she had arrived with. Vera moved the scope back to the spot where Foss had crouched. It was not distinguishable from the surrounding ground at this range. She could not tell what Foss had found or what she had done with it, but she could tell what the track line meant. Foss had been following a boot print, and the boot print she had been following was Vera's. She had been found. The question was what Foss had done about it. If Foss had reported the track to Strickland, this compound was going to become a very different kind of problem within the next 15 minutes. Strickland would redistribute his 9 positions. He would tighten the patrol patterns. He would alert the sentry rotation. Every advantage Vera had built over 26 hours would compress into something much smaller and much more dangerous in the time it took Strickland to walk from the operations building to a radio. She watched the compound. 15 minutes passed, nothing changed. The sentries continued their rotation. The lights in the operations building held steady. The 9th position completed a sweep, paused, completed another. No increased activity, no redistribution, no visual indication of a command responding to new intelligence. Foss had not reported it. Vera held that fact carefully, the way you hold something that might be exactly what it looked like or might be something else entirely, and you did not yet have enough information to know which. Foss had found a track and had not reported it. That could mean Foss was incompetent and had not recognized what she found. It could mean Foss had recognized it and made a decision that was not covered by any protocol Vera could construct a reason for. It could mean something else altogether, something that required information she did not have. She kept watching. The second hour after Foss's patrol brought 3 things in sequence that changed the texture of the problem as she was working. The first was a vehicle. It came up the service road from the south at a speed inconsistent with the standard supply run the compound received every 48 hours. Faster, purposeful. It parked inside the compound wall, which she could not see directly, but she could track it by the engine sound in the brief opening of the vehicle gate at the south end. 1 vehicle, light truck based on the sound profile. 2 passengers based on the brief voices she caught when the gate opened. Neither voice belonged to anyone she had heard in the compound's radio traffic over the past 26 hours. The second thing was Overton. He came out of the operations building at a pace that was not his usual pace. She had watched Overton move for 26 hours and she knew his pace. This was not it. This was the pace of a man who had received information and was processing it through his legs because his mind was too occupied to notice what his body was doing. He walked to the south wall, stood at it, looked over it in the direction of the parked vehicle. Then he pulled out a notebook she had not seen before and wrote something in it and put it back in his cargo pocket and stood at the wall for 4 more minutes without moving. The third thing was Strickland. He emerged from the operations building 7 minutes after Overton, and he walked to the same wall, and the 2 of them stood there together for what Vera estimated at 90 seconds without visible conversation. Then Strickland pointed at something she could not see over the wall. Overton nodded, one nod, slow, the kind a man makes when he is confirming something he already suspected rather than receiving new information. Then Strickland turned and walked back toward the operations building. He stopped halfway there, turned around, looked directly at the 9th position on the western ridge, then looked at the forest, not at Vera's sector, to the north at the tree line above the area where Foss had been walking an hour earlier. He looked at it for 7 seconds. Then he continued walking toward the building and did not look back. Vera noted the time, added it to everything else. She had been awake for 31 hours. She did not feel it yet in any way that affected her function. She had trained for this the way other people train for things that mattered, by doing it until it became incorporated rather than endured. Not about the absence of fatigue, about operating correctly inside it, the way a craftsman keeps steady hands, not because he isn't cold, but because cold hands learned over years to find their steadiness anyway. You did not eliminate the condition. You learned to work inside it until the working became its own form of warmth. She took water, controlled calories, shifted her weight, stayed. At hour 34, she heard the signal again, not from the compound wall. From inside the compound, diffuse, faint enough that she might have missed it if she had not spent the intervening 8 hours listening for it. Not through the door gap this time. Through the ventilation aperture on the west face of the main building, a narrow horizontal slot 40 centimeters wide, set into the stone 3 feet above ground level. She moved the scope to it, waited. The light came again, slow, deliberate. The same pattern as before, but different content. Longer, more characters, as if the sender had found more time or more urgency and was putting both into the message. She read it. It took her 90 seconds because the light was intermittent and the aperture was narrow, and she was reading at a range that required the kind of focus that consumed everything not directly related to the task. She read it twice to confirm. Then she sat with it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 40 seconds. 7 names, not random names. Names she could not have known before this moment, but whose arrangement and format she recognized immediately as the structure of a classified personnel roster. Rank, surname, last 4 of service number. 7 entries. Below them repeated 3 times in the signal, as if the sender knew it was the most important part and wanted to make certain it survived any degradation in transmission. A phrase she read and then read again, and felt move through her in the specific way that information moves when it reorganizes everything around it. Karsten knows. She lowered the scope. She looked at the pine needles in front of her face. She looked at the light coming through the canopy. She looked at her hands, which were steady, because her hands were always steady, and she had long since stopped using them as a gauge of what she was feeling. What she was feeling was not something she had a clean word for. It was the specific interior adjustment that happens when a model you have been using to navigate a situation is revealed to be wrong in a way that makes the situation more dangerous than you had assessed, and you have to update the model in real time while remaining in the situation. She had been running this mission as an operation with unusual parameters she did not fully understand. She was now running it as something else. Something the parameters she had been given were specifically designed to hide from her. The 6th sentence in the burned envelope. Non-lethal contact only. Not to protect the exercise. To protect something inside that compound from being killed before someone with the right clearance could find out what it knew. She reached for her comms, then stopped. She thought about Karsten's voice. The 8 seconds of silence before he told her to hold. The fact that he had not asked what the signal said. She thought about the 7 names in the roster she had just read. 7 people. 7 entries in the format used for classified personnel files. 7 people whose connection to Karsten she did not yet understand, but whose names were now stored in the only place she trusted completely, which was a mind that had never lost anything it decided to keep. She put the comms down without keying it. She turned back to the scope and looked at the ventilation aperture. The signal had stopped, but she had what she needed. She began calculating. The aperture was accessible from outside the compound wall via a crawl space under the building's foundation that appeared on the original construction schematic she had memorized before insertion. The schematic was 40 years old. Crawl spaces either remained navigable or they did not, and she had no way to verify which was true here without going to look. But the schematic showed the aperture connecting to a maintenance corridor that ran the length of the building's west face, and the maintenance corridor connected to the lower level via a stairwell that had not been on the compound's current floor plan. A lower level that had not been on the compound's current floor plan. She had been looking at this building for 34 hours and had not identified a lower level because the current floor plan, the one she had memorized from the briefing package that Karsten's office had provided, did not show one. The briefing package that Karsten's office had provided. She moved south along the tree line, then east toward the compound's south face. The route brought her to within 60 meters of the compound wall at a point that was in the coverage gap between the 7th and 8th sniper positions, a gap she had identified on the 2nd day and confirmed on the 3rd. It was not a large gap, it was sufficient. She moved through it in 4 minutes, pressed into the shadow of the south wall, listened. The compound inside the wall was the sound of a facility that had not yet received an alert. She had time. The approach to the ventilation aperture required her to cross 40 meters of open ground between the tree line and the compound wall that was not covered by the gap she had used for the thermal sensor shot. This stretch was in the coverage arc of the 7th position, a sniper she had confirmed on the northeast ridge. His scan cycle ran on a 14-minute interval with a consistent bias toward the eastern approach, which he covered for 11 of every 14 minutes, with the remaining 3 spent on a slow sweep of the western sector that Vera had been tracking long enough to trust. She had 3 minutes. She moved at the pace that maximized ground covered, while minimizing the visual profile of movement. Not running. Running was wrong. Running was a shape that the human eye was specifically calibrated to notice, because motion at that rate looked like a threat and not like the environment. She moved the way water moved when it was allowed to follow the shape of the ground beneath it. Continuous, low, part of the slope's natural geometry. 38 meters in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She pressed into the shadow of the wall, breathed, waited for the scan to complete, did not move until she had counted the full 14-minute interval and confirmed the seventh position had returned to its eastern bias. Then she went along the wall to the aperture. It was narrower than the schematic had suggested. 40 years of settlement had compressed the ground around it by perhaps 4 centimeters, which was not significant for most purposes and was significant for hers. She did not carry anything on her kit that she could not afford to lose, which meant the total width of her profile going through that aperture was the total width of her body, which was narrow enough for this to be possible and not by a margin she was comfortable with. She went through. The crawlspace was dry and cold and smelled like stone that had not had air move through it since the compound was built. She could see nothing. She moved by touch and memory of the schematic, keeping her left hand on the north wall, counting the distance by feel. 12 meters, a corner, 6 meters more. The stairwell access. She pushed the panel. It moved. She came up into a room that was not on any floor plan she had seen. Low ceiling, a single battery lantern in the corner providing enough light to see by, but not enough to be visible through any external aperture. And in the corner opposite the lantern, a man. He was on his knees, wrists shackled to an iron ring set into the stone wall, his head down. He was wearing civilian clothes that had been civilian clothes for long enough to tell a story without words. He looked like a man who had been in that room for weeks. Not days. Weeks. He looked up when he heard her come through the panel. His eyes adjusted. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said something that came out rough and compressed from disuse, like words being pushed through a channel that had been closed too long. I wasn't sure anyone would come. She crossed the room in 4 steps, crouched in front of him, looked at him the way she looked at everything she needed to assess quickly and correctly. His condition, his color, his eyes, whether he was lucid or performing lucidity, whether the information he carried was still intact, or whether the weeks in this room had compromised the man who was supposed to be carrying it. His eyes were clear. That was the most important thing. Whatever else had happened to him, his mind was still working. She said, "You sent 7 names." He nodded. "I memorized them." Something moved across his face. Relief was too simple a word for it. It was closer to what a man looks like when he has been holding something alone for a very long time, and someone finally takes one end of it. "There are more," he said. "The 7 are the ones I could confirm. The full list is encoded in a document I hid before they moved me. I can tell you where." "Tell me quickly," he told her. She locked it into memory without writing anything, without repeating it aloud, without any confirmation ritual at all, because the confirmation ritual was for people who did not fully trust the architecture of their own recall. Then she looked at his wrists. The shackle rings were standard restraint hardware, keyed, and she did not have the key. She looked at the ring in the wall, old iron set into mortar that had cracked in the years since installation. She took the multi-tool from her kit, selected the appropriate blade, began working the mortar at the ring's base. 40 seconds. Not enough. Well, what wasn't enough? She needed more time, and she did not have more time. She stopped, looked at him. "I cannot extract you tonight. The perimeter is too active, and I do not have a clean route with your mobility constraints." He looked at her. His jaw was set in the way that a man's jaw sets when he has accepted something difficult and is managing the acceptance rather than fighting it. "How long?" "I need to secure a route and communicate the location of the document to someone who can act on it through a clean channel, not through the channel I was briefed on." He understood what that meant. She could see it in his face. "You know about Karsten," he said. "I know enough." He was quiet for a moment, then, "How long have you known?" "Tonight." He nodded slowly. "I've known for 8 months." She looked at him. 8 months in this room with that knowledge and no way to move it to anyone who could use it. She did not say anything about what that represented, because there was nothing to say about it that would help either of them, and she had work to do. "I will come back," she said. "Stay with the signal." "I haven't stopped." She looked at him one more time. Then she moved back to the panel, through the crawl space, back along the wall, back through the outer wire, back into the trees. She was in her position with the scope to her eye before the 14-minute scan cycle completed its next rotation. The compound was quiet. The sentries were rotating. Strickland's light was still on in the operations building. She looked at her comms unit. She thought about Karsten's voice. Then she thought about the document location. Then she thought about the 7 names and the ones that came after them. Then she thought about what would happen if she keyed that radio right now and reported everything she had found to the man whose name was on the burned envelope at the bottom of a staging area ash pile 3 miles away. She set the comms down. She did not key it. She reached into her kit for a specific item she had carried for 13 years on every mission she had ever run, which was a small notebook with a red cover that she had never once written in, because the habit of her training had taught her to store everything in memory, and the notebook was not for writing things down. It was for something else, for the specific moment in a mission when the situation had moved far enough beyond its original parameters that she needed to acknowledge to herself that she had crossed a threshold. She opened it to the first page. Blank. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she closed it and put it back. She did not need to write it down. She knew what the threshold was. She had crossed it the moment she read those 2 initials on the compound wall and understood why Karsten had not asked what the signal said. She was no longer running the mission she had been sent to run. She was running the mission underneath it, and she had 36 hours of preparation still ahead of her before any of it could move. 36 hours to build something Karsten could not undo by the time he realized it was being built. She was going to use every one of them, not waiting, working, the same way she had worked the first 34 hours, which was to say invisibly, methodically, and without a single wasted motion. She put her eye back to the scope. Strickland's light was still on. She watched it, tracked the shadows moving behind the frosted glass of the operations window, identified his silhouette by the width of his shoulders and the specific way he held his head when he was thinking, which she had cataloged during 26 hours of watching him move through that compound. He was at a map. She could tell by the angle of his head and the stillness of his posture, not the stillness of a man who was done thinking, the stillness of a man who was working a problem that mattered enough to demand everything he had. She wondered what problem he was working. She wondered if any part of it was the same problem she was working. Then she put that question in the same holding place she used for everything she could not yet answer. And she settled in for the longest phase of what was already the longest sustained operation she had run in 13 years of this work. Not because the next action required extended stillness, because the next 36 hours required her to appear to do nothing while she built everything. And because the man in the room below that compound, with his cracked wrists and his 8 months of solitude and his certainty that the signals he was sending were reaching someone, deserved a person outside who was still watching when the time finally came to move. She stayed. The pine needles were cold against her elbows. The mountain was cold against her body. The scope was warm from her eye. She stayed. She did not sleep. Not because she could not. She had slept in worse conditions than this, in shorter windows, under greater duress. She had a technique that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, but occupied the narrow territory between them, where the body recovered without the mind fully surrendering its watch. She had used it twice during this insertion, each time for no more than 40 minutes, keeping one layer of consciousness turned outward toward the sounds of the mountain, while the rest of her went somewhere quiet and came back ready. She did not use it now because the next several hours required a quality of attention that rest could not improve. She was past the threshold where recovery changed the outcome. She was at the threshold where everything she had built over the preceding 36 hours either held or it did not, and whether it held depended on decisions she made in the darkness before dawn, each one sequential, each one dependent on the one before it, and none of them forgiving of the kind of error that comes from a mind that has gone soft. She spent the first 2 hours after returning from the crawl space doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. She lay in the depression. She kept her eye to the scope. She watched the compound cycle through its patterns. And she built, in the part of her mind that operated below the level of deliberate thought, a complete picture of what the next 36 hours needed to look like if the man in that underground room was going to leave it alive. The picture had 4 components. The document location Alton had given her needed to reach a channel Karsten did not control. The 7 names she carried in memory needed to reach the same channel at the same time because names without the document were arguable and the document without the names was incomplete. Karsten himself needed to be in a position where his response to exposure could not damage the people the exposure was meant to protect. And she needed to be off this mountain by the time all three of those things were in motion. She worked the sequencing until it resolved. Then she stopped working it and let it settle, because a plan that has been worked enough becomes rigid, and rigid plans do not survive contact with the variables the field always introduces. She had what she needed. She was going to hold it lightly. At hour 41, she heard the forest change, not dramatically. The gap in the ambient sound that she had learned to read over 2 days of full attention to this particular mountain arrived with the specific texture of something she had not heard before. Not one presence, not two. The distributed silence of multiple sources, offset from one another, moving with a kind of careful coordination that told her the people producing it had been trained by someone who understood how forests worked. She counted 3 by the time she had her scope repositioned toward the northeast. They were not rangers. She knew the ranger's movement signature by now, the way she knew the compound's century rotation, which was to say well enough to distinguish it from anything else in the dark. These 3 moved differently. A tighter interval between footfalls, a more deliberate weight distribution, the kind of sound profile produced by people for whom woodland movement was a primary professional skill, rather than a component of a broader tactical training. They were good. They were also converging on a point that was not quite her current position, 40 meters north-northeast, the area where she had been lying before she moved to approach the compound 6 hours earlier. They had a bearing on her original position, which meant they had information about where she had been rather than where she was. That information had to come from somewhere. She reached under the left side of her pack frame without looking, found the backup power cell Karsten's logistics officer had installed during the equipment check at the staging area 3 days ago. Standard issue. The kind of component no operator questioned because it was the kind that got replaced routinely. She held it in her palm. It was warm, not the warmth of a component that had been doing passive work in a cold environment. The warmth of active electronics, a transmitter drawing current and generating heat as a byproduct of sending a signal that had been sending. She now understood, since the moment she crossed the staging area perimeter and started up the slope. Karsten had known where she was every hour of this insertion. He had been patient about it because patience was the correct tool for what he was doing. Let her find what she was supposed to find. Let her get close enough, and then when the usefulness became a threat, send the people he had been keeping in reserve. She did not spend any time on what that meant about Karsten. She had already processed what it meant about Karsten when she read Karsten nose on the ventilation light and set the comms down without keying it. What she needed now was not more understanding. It was more time. She pried the power cell's casing open with her multi-tool blade. The transmitter module was inside, a flat component the size of a thumbnail, drawing from the cell's voltage through a simple induction circuit. She worked the module free from its mount, careful not to crack it in a way that would produce audible sound. Then she looked around the forest floor. A ground squirrel had been working a cache near the base of a pine tree 9 meters north of her position. She had watched it on the first morning. The cache was a disturbed patch of pine duff at the root base, pressed down and repressed with the specific repetitive pattern of an animal that returned to the same point many times. She moved to it on her knees, keeping her profile below the sight line of the nearest ridge, and pressed the transmitter module into the center of the disturbed duff. Covered it with a layer of dry needles, pressed lightly. The squirrel's scent would migrate over the module within the hour. She looked at the bearing the 3 operators were coming from and chose her next position. She moved south, low, fast enough to cover ground before the operators reached the point where she would be audible, but not so fast that her movement through the underbrush produced a signature. 100 meters in 90 seconds. She settled behind a fallen log with a sight line back to the approach corridor. The 3 operators converged on her previous position. She heard the change in their movement when they reached it. Footsteps slowing, stopping. The compressed silence of people assessing a space they expected to find occupied and finding it empty. Then low voices, professional, recalibrating. They began moving again, toward the transmitter signal, which was now 9 meters north of her former hide. Wrong direction entirely. She had 4 minutes before they understood what they were following. She used them to cover another 180 meters south along the tree line, moving inside the forest's shadow edge. using the pine canopy to suppress her silhouette against the graying sky. When the 4 minutes expired, she was in the secondary hide she had identified on day one, Mom, a compressed hollow between two root masses with a direct sight line to the compound's south face. She settled in, put the scope up, began the next phase. The south wall had a section at its base near the vehicle gate where a flat piece of pale granite had been incorporated into the construction, a feature of the original terrain the builders had worked around rather than displaced. She had been looking at it for 2 days. It was visible from the operations building doorway in the current light conditions, readable at 25 meters. She reached into her kit, Earth Pigment Pack, darkest available pigment. She uncapped it and looked at the stone. She was going to write 4 words. She had been composing them in her mind since she left the underground room and understood fully what she was dealing with. 4 words that would do 3 things simultaneously. Confirm to Strickland that Alton was alive. Force Karsten's hand before he expected it to be forced. And create a record, however temporary, of what she knew in a location where more than one person would see it. She moved to the wall, pressed her back against the stone, listened. The compound was quiet on the other side. The 7th position was in its eastern bias phase. She had 90 seconds. She wrote on the granite face with her finger, using the pigment the way a person writes when they have one chance and no margin. Alton, still breathing, asked why. She pressed her palm flat against the stone for 3 seconds to set the pigment in the morning damp. Then she pulled her hand back, looked at the 4 words once, and moved. Back along the wall, back through the outer wire, back into the hollow between the roots. She was resettled and had the scope back to her eye before the 7th position completed its eastern sweep. The compound was the same. Sentries rotating, operations building light steady. She watched and waited. 8 minutes after she returned, the 3 operators appeared at the south wall. They had given up on the transmitter bearing and doubled back, running the terrain in the systematic pattern of people who had lost a target and were reacquiring by coverage rather than signal. The first one found the stone, crouched, read, called the other 2 over with a hand signal. All 3 of them crouched in front of the granite and read what she had written. She watched through the scope from 60 meters while they read the same 4 words she had composed in an underground room with a shackled man and a single lantern. The first operator reached for his radio. His transmission lasted 11 seconds. Then he went still, listening. In his face, readable at this range through a scope she had been using long enough to trust at distances 4 times greater, changed in the way that faces change when information arrives that reorganizes the situation the face belongs to. Not alarm, something more complicated than alarm. The expression of a man who has just been told something that makes him uncertain about the chain of command he has been operating within, and is deciding in real time what that uncertainty means for his next action. She keyed her secondary comms, not Karsten's frequency, the Ranger team's internal channel, which she had memorized from the briefing package. Master Sergeant Overton, the man in the room below the operations building that is Wade Alton. He has been there for 8 months. He is alive. She released transmit. The light in the operations building changed, not suddenly. In the way that light changes when a person inside moves quickly past a fixture, redistributing the shadow pattern and then letting it resettle. Someone had moved fast. 30 seconds later, Overton's voice came through the Ranger channel. Not calm, controlled, which was not the same thing. Who is this? The person who has been on this mountain for 3 days watching your compound. The person Karsten sent personnel to contain 40 minutes ago. A silence. How do I know you're telling the truth? You don't, she said. You know what Alton's file says. You know when you last saw him. And you know I just told you something I should not know if I'm who Karsten told you I was. Do the math, Master Sergeant. You've been doing this work long enough to know what the math says. A shorter silence. The subfloor access, Overton said. West face, there's a crawl space. He knew. She had not known he knew. Yes, she said. I found it 4 months ago while running a maintenance check on the foundation drainage. His voice was even, but she heard what lived underneath the evenness. I reported it up the chain. The report was acknowledged and closed with a notation that the access had been sealed in a prior renovation. I checked the wall myself. It had not been sealed. He had found it. He had reported it. And Karsten, or someone with access to Karsten's level, had buried the report and left the access open. That report went to Karsten's office, she said. A pause. It would have. He needed the access to remain functional, she said. He needed what's below that floor to remain accessible on his terms and no one else's. The compound's south gate opened. One figure, Overton's pace moving at the deliberate speed of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 4 months and had just been given a reason to set it down by acting on it rather than holding it. He walked toward the west face of the main building. She watched him find the ventilation aperture. Crouch, look at the ground around it, then look up at the forest in the direction of the tree line. Not at her position, but at the general space she occupied. The way a man looks when he knows he is being watched and wants to acknowledge it without being able to locate the source. He went through the aperture. She kept the scope on the building. 11 minutes, 12. Then Overton came back out. He stood at the west wall for a moment. He was not the same man who had gone in. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the specific way he was holding his neck, in the posture of a person who has just converted suspicion into certainty and is now standing in the brief space between knowing and acting. He looked at the compound around him with the eyes of someone recalibrating every familiar surface. Then he keyed his radio. He talked for 40 seconds. She watched his face while he spoke, and she could read enough of it to know that he was saying the most consequential thing a man in his position could say to another man in Strickland's position, which was the truth, delivered without qualification or softening, because the time for either of those had passed. Strickland came out of the operations building 30 seconds after Overton released his transmit button. Not walking, moving with the contained urgency of a man whose stillness has just been given a reason to end. He crossed to Overton. They spoke for 40 seconds in low voices she could not hear at this range. Then Strickland pulled his personal radio. Not the standard command net, something else. A channel he reached for with the specific directness of a man who knew the number from memory because he had been waiting for a reason to use it. The call lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Strickland lowered the radio and stood with his arms at his sides for a count of 10. Looking at the operations building, looking at the compound around him, looking at everything he had built here and what it had been used to protect and what it had been used to hide. Then he turned toward the forest. He looked at the tree line above the south wall. He could not see her. She was invisible at this range in this terrain under these conditions to every human eye and every optical instrument available to the people in that compound. She had made herself part of the mountain over 3 days, and the mountain did not give her up. He looked anyway. He said something that was not into his radio and not to Overton and not to anyone standing near him. He said it to the forest, to the space where he understood, without being able to confirm it, that she was watching. She read his lips across 60 meters of Carolina pine air and early morning light. He said, "Good." One word, flat, carrying more weight than most sentences carried. Then he turned back to the compound and walked toward the operations building with the step of a man who had a great deal to do and had just received the information that told him exactly where to begin. She keyed the emergency frequency she had memorized 13 years ago and never used until tonight. Entered the authentication sequence. Waited. The response came in under a minute. A voice she did not know. Female. The professional calm of someone for whom calls on this channel were part of a job she had been doing for years. Authenticate. She gave her service number, her unit designation, and the name of the officer who had provided her code. Then the document location. Then the 7 names in the exact sequence she had received them. Then the name of the operative in the room below the compound, his condition, the restraint configuration, and the crawlspace access point. Then Mission Coordinator Major Lyle Karsten is the subject of the compromise. He is aware of this insertion and has dispatched personnel to my location. 3. Currently on the south perimeter. A pause that was shorter than she expected. Copy, Sergeant. We have been waiting to receive this call. We are moving. What is your current status? Operational, 1 priority. The operative's condition has been stable, but his timeline is not indefinite. He needs extraction. Understood, 90 minutes. She released transmit. 90 minutes. She looked at the compound and thought about the man below it. And she thought about what 90 minutes meant to someone who had been counting minutes in an underground room for 8 months. Then she put that thought somewhere it could not slow her down and focused on the 3 operators still working the perimeter to her south. They had moved off the granite stone and were now running a search pattern along the south wall's exterior, covering ground methodically in the pattern of people who had accepted that their primary target information was compromised and were now falling back on terrain saturation. She watched them work for 6 minutes, tracked their pattern, identified the point where their coverage would bring the third and most cautious of the three into an approach corridor that she needed clear. She moved, not to engage, to redirect. She worked north along the inside of the tree line for 80 meters, then stopped at a dead pine that had been standing long enough to have shed most of its bark and stood now as a pale column visible at range in the growing light. She took a stone from the ground, threw it hard against the dead pine's upper section. The sound it produced was a sharp crack, directional, carrying south in the light morning air, landing in the search pattern's coverage zone like a footstep. The third operator stopped, turned toward the sound, moved toward it, away from her corridor. She was back in her position with the scope up before the operator covered 20 meters. The helicopter arrived from the east at low altitude, fast and deliberate, dropping over the ridge and putting down in the compound's center yard before the sentries had completed a full rotation. Two figures disembarked before the skids fully settled. Civilian dress, the bearing of people for whom urgency was a professional state rather than an emotional one. They were inside the operations building in under 90 seconds. The meeting inside lasted 4 minutes. She tracked it by shadow movement through the frosted glass. Then Strickland and Overton came out together, moving toward the west face of the main building, and Strickland had a set of keys in his hand that he had not been carrying before he went inside. She watched them go through the building, watched the 4 minutes it took, watched Alton emerge into the compound yard with Overton's hand on his arm and the specific, careful gait of a man who had been stationary long enough that his body was relearning the mechanics of forward motion. Alton stopped in the middle of the yard. He stood still for a moment and looked up. The sky was changing color. The band along the eastern horizon had shifted from black to a deep blue-gray that was the specific color of the 20 minutes before first light, the color she had watched from enough positions on enough mountains to know it as precisely as a clock face. He stood in that light with his head back and his eyes open, and he breathed the compound air, which was the same as the outside air, because there was no wall between him and the sky for the first time in 8 months. She watched through the scope. She had never met him. She knew his name from a classified file and his initials from the wall of a compound and his voice from 40 seconds in an underground room with a single lantern. She had spent 3 days on this mountain on his behalf without knowing for most of those days that he was the reason she was here. She watched him breathe. Her emergency comms lit. "Sergeant Colston, asset is secured. Your extraction is inbound. Can you mark?" She reached into her kit. Infrared chem light. Cracked it. Held it above the root mass for a count of 3. "We have you," the voice said. 4 minutes. The second helicopter came from the north, low along the valley floor, and put down in the flat clearing 200 meters north of her position that she had identified on the first morning of the insertion as the most viable landing zone within reach of the hide. She gathered her kit, settled the Mark 13 across her back, stood for the first time in a long time, and her body cataloged the standing in the detailed and impartial way that 71 hours of sustained fieldwork produced. Every complaint, specific and accurate, and none of them conditions she had not carried before. She walked to the helicopter. Alton was already there. They had brought him around the compound's exterior, and he was sitting in the helicopter's open door with a blanket across his shoulders and both hands around a cup that steamed in the cold morning air. He looked up when she came into the clearing. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There was not a great deal to say that the situation had not already communicated more precisely than words could have. She had been in a hold in a mountain for 3 days. He had been in a room beneath a mountain for 8 months. They were both outside in the same air now. The sky above them was the same sky. "You read the whole signal," he said. "Both of them." He nodded. He looked at his hands. The marks from the restraints were visible at this distance in the growing light. He looked at them the way a person looks at evidence of something they are beginning, slowly, to put behind them. "How many names did you get?" 7, she said. "You said there were more." 12 in the document." He paused. "Karsten is the 12th. She nodded. She had known that. Not from the signals. From the shape of everything else. The way a form resolves when enough pieces are in place, and the remaining pieces can only be one thing. "He will be in custody within the hour," she said. "The people in that helicopter are IG. They have the document location. They have the 7 names." Something moved in Alton's face. 8 months of a particular kind of thinking did not revise in seconds. She watched it happen in the slower way that real changes happen, Not the sudden reorganization that happens in crisis, but the longer adjustment that happens when crisis ends and the mind has to find a new way of orienting itself to the world it is back in. Overton appeared at the clearing's edge. He looked at Vera. She looked at him. They had never spoken directly in person, and there was nothing that required saying now. But he held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she understood two things about him simultaneously: that he had suspected for 4 months and had not had enough to act on, and that he was the kind of man who would carry those 4 months as his own accounting to settle regardless of what the formal record said. She looked away. Strickland was at the compound gate 30 meters back. He had not walked to the clearing. He stood at the gate with his arms at his sides and his posture very straight, and he was looking at her across the open ground with the expression that she had seen on him for 3 days, and that had changed since she put 4 words on a granite stone in the dark. The certainty was gone, not replaced by defeat, replaced by something more durable than certainty, which was the specific gravity of a man who has seen what he needed to see and understood what it cost and accepted the cost, because the alternative was not seeing it, and not seeing it would have been worse. She held his look for 3 seconds. He had chosen her for this. She had understood that since the emergency frequency call when the voice on the other end received her authentication without surprise. 6 months ago, in whatever room that conversation had happened in, he had decided she was the right person for the mission underneath this mission. He had not told her. He could not tell her, because telling her would have told Karsten, and Karsten had access to every channel her mission ran through, except the one she had carried in memory for 13 years. He had sent her in with one hand tied and trusted the other hand to be enough. She did not know how she felt about that. She noted that she did not know, which was itself useful information, and put it in the place she put things she was going to think about when she was somewhere with more time than this. She turned back to the helicopter. The pilot was completing his check. Alton had his eyes up, watching the sky lighten by degrees. The IG personnel were settled and ready. She climbed in. She looked out the open door as the aircraft lifted, the compound below, the ridgelines where 9 positions had been watchful and patient and ultimately blind to the one thing they were supposed to see. The pine forest that had held her for 71 hours and was releasing her now into the morning without ceremony, without evidence, without any mark of passage except the things she carried out of it in her memory. Alton sat across from her. He had stopped looking at his hands. He was looking at the mountain the way she was looking at it, from the outside now, with the distance that changes what a thing looks like without changing what the thing is. The helicopter banked east. The mountain fell away below them, and the first real light of the morning found the ridgeline and held it for a moment in the specific gold that exists only in the minutes before the sun clears the horizon and the light is still traveling at an angle. Then the angle changed and the ridge was gray again, and the compound was a cluster of shapes in a valley, and the 9 positions on the ridgelines were empty stone. She put her head back against the airframe. Her body registered the 71 hours the way it always registered a sustained operation when the operation ended and gave it permission. Not catastrophically, like a long conversation finding a lower register. She was tired in every dimension of the word. She was also in the brief interior space between the completion of a thing and the arrival of whatever came next. And that space, in her experience, was where the most honest accounting happened. Not the formal debrief, not the report, the private inventory a person takes when they are 40 feet in the air over a mountain they just spent 3 days on and nobody is asking them anything yet. The inventory was straightforward. She had been sent to run one mission. She had run a different one, the one underneath. She had made that decision alone, without authorization, at the moment when the available information made authorization impossible and inaction indefensible. She would account for that decision in whatever rooms asked her to account for it, and she would stand by the accounting because the decision had been correct. The man across from her was alive because of it. That was the complete inventory. She closed her eyes. Below the helicopter, Foss stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the aircraft shrink against the brightening sky. She had not been asked to board. She had not asked to board. She stood in the clearing with the pine trees behind her and the compound visible in the middle distance, and the morning coming in from the east over the ridgeline, and she watched until the helicopter was a sound rather than a shape, and then a silence rather than a sound. Then she looked down at her right hand, She had been holding it since the moment she crouched in the pine duff 16 hours ago and recognized the boot print and understood what it meant. A single spent cartridge case. Brass. Size for a .300 Winchester Magnum. Cold now, after a night of being carried against her palm. She turned it between her fingers once. Then she crouched at the base of the nearest pine tree, at the edge of the clearing where the forest started, and set it down carefully in the needles. Pressed it lightly into the duff so the wind would not move it. She looked at it for a moment. One cartridge case at the root of a pine tree, at the edge of a clearing on a mountain in North Carolina that most people had never heard of. No one would find it. No one would know what it marked. In 6 months, the needles would cover it entirely. That was fine. Some things did not need to be found to have been real. Foss stood up, looked once more at the sky where the helicopter had been. Then she turned and walked back toward the compound, and the clearing was quiet behind her, and the mountain was quiet around her, and the morning came the rest of the way in over the eastern ridge and lit everything it found there without prejudice or announcement. The sky was fully light now. The mountain held its silence.